In the summer of 1483, the Tower of London wasn't known for being a place of fear. At least not yet. For two young boys, it was a royal palace with impenetrable stone walls and beautiful gardens to get lost in. 12-year-old Edward, who was to be crowned as King Edward V, and his 9-year-old brother Richard were just children, waiting for the biggest moment of their lives, Edward's coronation. But the road to that day began with tragedy. On April 9, 1483, their father, King Edward IV, died suddenly after an illness that lasted only 3 weeks. At the time, young Edward was living at Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, while his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. News of the king's death reached Gloucester around April 15th. Richard went to York Minster, where he made a public show of loyalty to the new king, his 12-year-old nephew. And according to the Croyland Chronicle, Edward IV had named Richard as his Lord Protector before his death. But that didn't make Richard's authority certain. The Privy Council, after all, wasn't bound to follow the wishes of a dead king. Still, it was Richard who stepped into the parental role. He was now the man responsible for the young Edward and his brother Richard, their protector, sworn to keep them safe. He was the one who brought Edward to the Tower for his protection. He was the one who persuaded their mother to release Richard from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey so the brothers could be together. But once he had both boys behind those walls, the whole game changed. The palace became a prison. First, their appearances in the gardens stopped. Then, they weren't seen looking out of the windows anymore. Before long, they were gone. Completely. Their disappearance was followed by a ruthless political power play. A preacher declared from the pulpit that the princes were illegitimate. Parliament made it official soon after, stripping the boys of their claim to the throne. With the boys erased on paper, Richard of Gloucester decided they should be erased in life as well. In July 1483, he took the crown as Richard III, and with that, the princes were never seen or heard from again. Think about that for a second. A future king, next in line to the throne, and his heir, just vanished from the face of the earth. It's the question that's haunted history. Did their uncle, the man charged with protecting them, order their deaths? That's the story Shakespeare made famous in Richard III, and it's the one that has stuck for over 500 years. Almost 2 centuries later, in 1674, workers demolishing a staircase in the tower uncovered a wooden box. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. The king at the time, King Charles II, was convinced they had found the lost princes. He had the remains buried in Westminster Abbey, where they rest to this day. But there's no proof the bones truly belong to Edward and Richard. And maybe that's part of what makes this story so chilling. It's not just about whether a king murdered his nephews. It's about how 2 children, heirs to the throne of England, could be made to disappear in such a brutal way. Their uncle promised to protect them. Instead, he decided that he was only going to look after himself and his path to power. In the crowded, noisy marketplaces of ancient Athens, among the merchants shouting and politicians debating the issues of the day, there was a man who lived in a giant clay jar. He was one of the most famous and strangest figures of his time, and possibly the world's first and most committed performance artist. His name was Diogenes the Cynic, and the stories about him are legendary. Diogenes believed that all of society, its rules, its manners, its obsession with money and power, was a complete scam. His goal was to live a life of total freedom, free from all possessions and conventions. He described his philosophy as living like a dog. In fact, the very word cynic comes from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like. It captured both his shameless way of life and his belief in living simply, without social pretenses. And he wasn't joking. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back, and even discarded his one possession, a wooden bowl, after watching a child drink water with his bare hands. He would walk through the city in broad daylight holding a lit lantern, and when people asked what he was doing, he'd reply, "I am just looking for an honest man." When the great philosopher Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken, stormed into Plato's academy, and threw it at his feet, shouting, "Behold, I've brought you a man." His most famous moment came when he was visited by Alexander the Great. The young conqueror, the most powerful man in the world, was fascinated by this strange philosopher. He approached Diogenes as he was sunbathing and offered to grant him any favor. Diogenes didn't even sit up. He simply looked at the king and said, "Yes, stand out of my light." So what's the mystery here? It's not what happened to him, but who he really was beneath the public spectacle. We have 0 writings from Diogenes himself. Everything we know is secondhand, written down by others years or even centuries later. Some view him as a brilliant social critic, using shock tactics to expose the hypocrisy of the world around him. Others believe he was a genius who understood that the only path to true freedom was to desire nothing. Some saw Diogenes as a mentally ill outcast, whose strange behavior was later polished and romanticized into a coherent philosophy. But to others, his defiance of authority was a profound statement. And then there were some that thought it was simply the mark of a man who could not function within society. We can never know for sure. The real Diogenes is lost to us, hidden behind the larger-than-life caricature. He's the ultimate historical mystery, a man who lived his life in public, yet remains completely unknowable. Maybe that was his final point. He forces us to look at our own lives, our own obsessions, and ask what's really blocking our own sun. Of all the terrifying stories to come out of the misty, jagged coasts of Scotland, none is quite as stomach-turning as the legend of Sawney Bean. It's a tale that feels less like historical fact, and more like a horror story told around a campfire. Most versions place it in the late 1500s, during the reign of James VI of Scotland. The story goes that a man named Alexander Sawney Bean and his partner turned their backs on society and disappeared into the wild. They found a deep cave on the coast of Ayrshire that was hidden by the tides, and they made it their home for the next 25 years. There, they built a massive family, dozens of children and grandchildren, all the product of incest, eventually growing into a clan of nearly 50 people. To survive, they became highwaymen, predators. They would ambush travelers on the lonely coastal roads, drag them back to their cave, and murder them. But they didn't just take their victims' money, they also ate them. The Bean clan were cannibals, pickling the leftovers and storing the severed limbs in their horrifying sea cave pantry. For years, people vanished without explanation. Locals grew fearful, often blaming innkeepers and hanging the innocent, while the real killers remained undetected. The clan's reign of terror ended when they attacked a man and his wife. The husband, a skilled fighter, managed to hold them off as they tore his wife from her horse and butchered her on the spot. He escaped and told the authorities his unbelievable story. King James himself supposedly led a 400-man posse with bloodhounds to hunt the clan down. They finally found the cave at low tide and discovered a scene from hell, a damp, foul-smelling cavern littered with stolen goods and human remains. The entire clan was captured and, without a trial, executed in the most brutal ways imaginable. Reportedly, not one of them showed the slightest hint of remorse. It's a perfect self-contained nightmare. There's just one big problem. There is no real proof any of it ever happened. Historians have scoured the records. There are no court documents mentioning a cannibal clan. No chronicles from that time detailing the disappearance of hundreds of people in Ayrshire. The story first appears in print in the 1700s, centuries after the events supposedly took place, in a sensationalist English crime catalog called the Newgate Calendar. That leaves the real mystery not with Sawney Bean himself, but with the story. Some believe it was propaganda, designed to paint the Scots as barbaric savages. Others think it was a local legend, a dark folktale meant to warn travelers of the dangers of traveling alone. Either way, the story of Sawney Bean has had a powerful grip on the imagination for centuries. The real mystery isn't whether a man could become a monster, but why we, as a society, sometimes need to invent them. Sawney Bean may never have lived, but he represents something deeper. The fear of what humanity becomes when it turns its back on compassion and embraces the dark. It's rare for a single life to contain so much adventure, but the story of the Chevalière d'Eon reads like a dozen lives rolled into one. It's a story that involves international espionage, royal blackmail, military honors, and a mystery so personal it remains unsolved 200 years later. For the first 49 years of life, Charles d'Eon was, by all accounts, an exceptional man. A brilliant lawyer, a published author, and a captain of the dragoons who fought bravely for France in the 7 Years' War. Beyond the battlefield, he carried out covert missions for King Louis XV as part of the king's private intelligence network, the Secret du Roi. In Russia, he is said to have worn the disguise of a woman to secure his position at the imperial court. After the war, d'Eon was sent to London as a diplomat, where his life took a dramatic turn. When his superiors demanded he return to France, d'Eon resisted. Holding state secrets that could have humiliated the monarchy, he leveraged them into a lifelong pension. It was during this exile in London that rumors about d'Eon's gender, which had followed him for years, exploded. The London Stock Exchange even opened a betting pool on if d'Eon was truly a man or a woman. But here's where the story goes from strange to unprecedented. With the death of Louis XV, the new king, Louis XVI, allowed Dionne to return to France, but only under one condition. He must live as a woman, including the terms that Dionne had to officially declare himself a woman and wear women's clothing for the rest of his life. The state even paid for the transformation, commissioning gowns and accessories for the celebrated spy. From that day on, the decorated male soldier and spy Charles Dionne became the celebrated socialite, the Chevalière Dionne. She lived this way for the next 33 years, mostly in England, a celebrity known throughout Europe. She even kept up her famous fencing demonstrations, fighting skilled opponents while wearing a full dress and corset. After Dionne's death in 1810, an autopsy was performed, and the doctors found that she had male anatomy. The discovery shocked the public and only deepened the mystery. Dionne lived in a time that had no language for the complexities of gender identity that we talk about today. The mystery of the Chevalière isn't about finding a simple answer, but about marveling at a person who navigated the rigid world of 18th century Europe and forced it to acknowledge them on their own terms, as both a celebrated man and a celebrated woman. On the surface, there was nothing mysterious about Edgar Cayce. Born in 1877, he was a soft-spoken and deeply religious man from rural Kentucky with an 8th grade education. He spent his early years working as a bookstore clerk and later as a photographer. He was, by all appearances, a perfectly ordinary man, except when he fell asleep. Cayce would lie on a couch, fold his hands over his stomach, and enter a self-induced trance. He spoke with absolute clarity, diagnosing the illnesses of people he had never met, sometimes living hundreds of miles away. His voice, calm and precise, described their conditions in technical medical language, prescribing diets, herbal remedies, and chiropractic adjustments. His wife or a stenographer recorded every word. Cayce realized he had this ability when he fell ill as a young man. Struck with laryngitis that left him nearly mute, he entered a trance and described his own condition, a psychological paralysis of the vocal cords. He dictated a cure. When he awoke, his voice had returned. From that moment, the request never stopped. For 40 years, he delivered more than 14,000 readings, each carefully transcribed and cataloged. People mailed in desperate pleas from across the country, and many swore they were cured by his guidance. As the years passed, the content of the readings widened beyond medicine, into topics such as reincarnation, Atlantis, prophecy, and a vast philosophy that Cayce himself barely understood. That was the strangest part. In his waking life, Cayce claimed no memory of what he said while in the trance. He was just as shocked as everyone else by the medical terms that rolled effortlessly from his mouth. He was unsettled, even disturbed, by the visions of past lives, which clashed with his strict Christian beliefs. He never grew rich from his work, often offering readings without payment. To many, it seemed Cayce was as much a mystery to himself as he was to anyone else. To his followers, he was a prophet, a man who tapped into divine knowledge or a universal consciousness. To others, he was a rare psychological phenomenon, like a savant, a genius whose subconscious mind absorbed fragments of medical texts and, in a trance, reassembled them into something extraordinary. But others believed that it was all an elaborate, decades-long hoax. But if it was one of the most selfless and unprofitable cons in history. The mystery of Edgar Cayce is about the very nature of human consciousness. This was a simple man who, by all accounts, had access to an ocean of knowledge the moment he closed his eyes. Whether you believe he was a prophet, a psychological wonder, or a fraud, you're left with the undeniable fact of the thousands of readings he left behind. A library of impossible information, all from the mind of a sleeping photographer from Kentucky.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fireside Unsolved. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Until next time, take it easy and be easy, you filthy bastards.